Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of the Melbourne Press Club's webinar series on the battle against misinformation and disinformation. I'm Nick Richardson, I'm CEO of the Melbourne Press Club. Firstly, I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. I'd like to pay respect to their elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who are on this webinar. All of us know the power of good information. It's central to how we run our lives, from the most basic of a bus timetable to the most consequential, the health of our national economy. But in the past few years, the reliability of that information, the key building blocks of what journalists use to assemble stories, has shifted. Remarkably, facts may not be facts. What we took as established truths have come under question. So how do we, as information consumers and information users, deal with this changed environment? That's the premise behind our webinar series. And today we kick off the series with a discussion that goes right to the heart of that question: the testing of facts and the verification of trusted sources. So please join us for the next two webinars on the following two Wednesdays. So coming in next Wednesday and the Wednesday afterwards, when we look in more detail at the role misinformation and disinformation plays initially in elections. In this year of global elections, it has never become more important consideration in the exercise of democracy. And then in the third week of our webinar series, the regulatory and legislative approaches that could help us navigate this new landscape. But for today's discussion, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator. She's the Conversation Australia's Deputy Editor, Fron Jackson-Webb, and she also leads the site's health coverage. Fron was one of the Conversation's founding editors in 2011 and was later its Chief of Staff. She's previously managed the Australian Medical Association's Victorian Media Office and worked for BBC Magazines in London. Fron is proud of her Aboriginal heritage and lives on Dja Dja Wurrung country in central Victoria. Fron, over to you to introduce today's panellists and shepherd us through the discussion in today's webinar. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Nick, and I'm so pleased to be here having this most important discussion today. Okay, so let me introduce you to the fact checkers. First up, we have Jim Warren for the New York Daily News, and he was the co-founder of the Chicago News Cooperative, which fed into the print version of the New York Times. Jim has been a media, labour and legal affairs reporter and a political analyst for CNN, MSNBC and Fox. So welcome, Jim. Next up, we have Ben James. So Ben is a journalist and editor and an author with more than a decade of experience working at news organisations, both in Australia and in the UK. He's been the editor of AAP Fact Check since February 2022, a good time to take on that role, and previously worked across various News Corp titles. So let's kick off by talking a little bit more about what you two do day to day. So Ben, let's start with you. Can you tell us how fact-checking works at AAP?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. So yeah, as you mentioned, I've been in the role for a little over 2 years. At AAP Fact Check, we are third-party fact check partners with Meta, so that's Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and TikTok as well. And we have fact checkers based across Australia and in New Zealand, and we also cover the Pacific Island nations as well. And yeah, so we have what we call like kind of contract fact checking, which is our kind of TikTok and Facebook fact checking, and that's kind of very important to us. It's obviously a good source of revenue, but it also, I mean, it's quite powerful in a way, in that we can rate mis and disinformation on those platforms, and we work with those platforms to stop the spread of that misinformation and disinformation in a number of ways. So it's quite a lot of power, and something we take very seriously and don't take for granted. I guess the other side of our work is our kind of political fact checking, which is kind of separate from our contract fact checking with Meta and TikTok, in that they don't delve so much into kind of political claims, and that's something we see as kind of slightly separate, the same kind of processes. That's something that's obviously kind of very important to us and very important to AAP as AAP's kind of wider goals. Then I guess the other part of what we do is media literacy. We see media literacy as a kind of really important part of what we do in that, we can't be there to debunk every piece of mis and disinformation. So it's about kind of tooling up the kind of general public to deal with the deluge of information that they're met with each day.
Okay, thank you. And Jim, NewsGuard's model is quite unique in the media landscape, isn't it? Can you tell us a bit more about how you do things at NewsGuard? You're just on mute, so you'll need to unmute.
There you go. Sorry about that. Well, hi on a Tuesday night from Chicago. We started 5 years ago and saw ourselves and see ourselves as sort of having a broader mandate than just fact-checking lots of individual stories. We were premised on the notion that certainly here in the States, I assume it's similar in Australia, that faith in the media was plummeting, and that we simply didn't trust algorithms to figure out whether things were false or not, and that we would rely on sort of two-legged human journalists who actually call for comment, which is something algorithms don't do, to assess the general credibility of news information sites. We came up with 9 criteria, all of which one would look at and go, yeah, sure, right? Who can dispute the validity of one criterion being, do you tell the world who your owner is? Do you tell it who your editors are? Do you have a corrections policy? Do you run corrections? We have 9 of those. And we have a bunch of trained journalists, we have about 35 in all, who use every possible source they can to figure out whether a site meets those 9 criteria. We've now done more than 10,000 news information sites in the US, Europe, Canada, and Australia in the last year, and then stumbled into a side business when we were called up by major ad agencies in the US to do the same thing for television newscasts. And then now we have a flourishing business in assessing podcasts. So my regular day will include not just looking at maybe a website in Australia, but it could be a podcast there or a podcast in England or Austria, as well as a TV show. Interesting enough, and I'll sort of wrap up, we initially thought, because we were all political junkies, that the primary source of misinformation that we would find would be politics and government. Long before the pandemic, we found that no, it was health misinformation, which is why one of our partners is now the World Health Organization. They were so impressed by our work in ferreting out health misinformation that they partner with us, as do about 800 public libraries. Microsoft is now a partner. Again, all these big ad agencies. I can't disclose who is paying us to assess podcasts. I'll leave it to your imagination. And lots of schools in this country. And so we ended up doing a lot of work on health misinformation. And then comes AI. And we do lots of special reports now on AI and the perils of AI. And, by and large, have done a lot of work also of late in assessing the false claims of authoritarian governments that engage in hostile information warfare. Just in the last few weeks, we've done a lot of stuff on Putin-supported websites trashing Zelensky, with a bunch of false claims, including how somehow he used Western-provided funds to buy yachts and an estate owned by King Charles.
There's no shortage, is there?
Yeah. So anyway, that's basically what we do. Unlike some fact checkers, we don't rely on grants from the social media platforms, and we don't take any money from media companies, which makes it a real challenge for us to get funding. But we're doing okay.
And Ben, I'm just wondering, Jim said that he employs, or his organisation employs about 35 journalists. How big is your team?
We've grown recently, which is great news and a good kind of indication of hopefully where AP Fact Check is going. But we're up to about kind of 15 staff now. Which is really encouraging.
And speaking of encouraging, one thing I just might say that hasn't been broached. A couple things. First of all, I just realized I think the Conversations website is one of a small group that get a perfect score of 100 from us. It's a small group of the 10,000 that get a 100. And also, I should say that one thing that's been somewhat reassuring is that about 20% of the websites we've rated have subsequently taken precautions and steps to improve their rating from us. And it may just be, dealing with one of our 9 criteria, which they may have failed, and includes sites from Times of London, the London Sun, to Fox News, to Reuters, even the New York Times. The New York Times, until I pestered them, most famous media organization in the world, arguably, maybe the most influential, did not disclose anywhere on their site who owned it. Did not disclose that an entity called the New York Times Company owned it. As a result of our pestering them, they now disclose that and link to a corporate site. And it's been the same with lots of other sites, including NBC News, which said they were owned by an entity called NBC Universal. And we said, no, that's not true. You're owned by a big cable Goliath called Comcast. So that's why you're flunking. And they quickly changed. Now, it's been a lot harder with many of the sites that we fail, particularly on more fundamental areas of credibility, such as mixing news and opinion. The changes that some of them have made have been a lot slower or non-existent.
Sorry about that. Seem to be having some internet issues. Okay, can everyone hear me now?
Right.
Yeah, gotcha.
Okay. Let's turn to a little bit of kind of housekeeping for this session. We've talked about mis and disinformation. Jim, can you explain the difference between the two and whether that impacts your approach to correcting that information?
Yeah, we generally refer to disinformation as the intentional spreading and perhaps actual creation of false claims. And as I sort of alluded to before, more often than not, we found by a lot of authoritarian governments that engage in hostile information warfare, like what you've seen with Putin and Zelensky. We use misinformation generally to refer to claims that we may not know are intentionally false, such as a slew of the health claims misinformation we found that something called ivermectin cures COVID, or peach pits. Eating peach pits might cure your pancreatic cancer. Some of the stuff is laughable, but it's scary how large the audiences are. Huge. I mean, there's sites that people have never heard of that have much bigger audiences in this country than those of, say, the Mayo Clinic, maybe the most esteemed hospital, or the U.S. Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And all you got to do is talk to your friendly doctor and hear their horror stories of the patients who increasingly come in frustrated and say, well, why aren't you suggesting that I have such and such? That'll cure my whatever. And it's interesting how many of the doctors have had no clue about the growth of this misinformation, where their patients are finding this stuff, which is part of the reason we have a few hospitals who now offer us for free to their staffs. I mean, it's a few prestigious ones, but still it's a very small group.
And Ben, does it impact your decision to check something or not if you know that it is a knowing spread of misinformation, or if it is just an accident?
No, not really. I mean, our definition is very similar to how Jim explained it, and I think regardless of whether someone really believes what it is that they're spreading, it's having the same impact. I mean, on the audience that's receiving it. I mean, you look at a lot of the kind of the COVID bad information that was spread around the time of the vaccines in particular. Yes, there was some disinformation, but a lot of it was misinformation. The anti-vaxxers who spread that stuff genuinely believed it and still do. That doesn't mean it's any less dangerous or harmful. So yeah, we tend to treat them exactly the same. I mean, certainly when we're thinking about our checks and our debunks, we attack the claim rather than the person making the claim. And I mean, quite often you just don't know. You don't know the person's intentions behind it. So yes, no, we treat them very much the same.
And how do you assess
I might add, Fran, that we also have, we're a small crew, but we've also come to hire analysts who also speak Russian, Chinese, Iranian, and thus have helped us sort out Russian, Chinese, Iranian disinformation, as well as what had been our bread and butter, which is healthcare, politics, elections, things like that. So we've done a lot of stuff on those governments.
So how do you choose what to fact check? There's so much misinformation out there, and some of the claims are really kooky, and we know that some of them will take off and some won't. How do you decide which facts you'll dedicate your resources to, and which ones are just so kooky that you want to leave them alone?
Yeah, it's tricky, and there are a number of different things that we take into account when we are deciding on a check. We look at things like audience, whether it's kind of contemporary, is it trending, is it viral? But I think the two main things that I ask myself when deciding on whether to do a fact check is it consequential, and is it provably false? And if it ticks those two boxes, we'll generally kind of do the check. Now, what do I mean by consequential? It's a fairly kind of vague term, but we certainly don't want to be seen as pedants up on our high horse correcting everything after the fact. So I mean, if you're talking about politics, if with the budget last week, if Peter Dutton claimed the government had wasted $480,000 on something, it was actually $470,000. We're unlikely to do it. And yeah, she mentioned some of the kind of the kind of kookier claims. Like, we don't tend to do the kind of flat earth stuff anymore. That's, you kind of think, people do believe it, what's the real harm? So yeah, we don't check everything, but it's those two things that we ask ourselves. And I mean, just turning to the second one, that is it provably false? I think that's where a lot of the potentially false or damaging information kind of falls out of the scope of fact checking, in that, if we're doing a fact check, if we're tackling a claim, we want to absolutely kind of kill it dead there and then. When I'm looking at a fact check, when I'm looking at copy, I'm not looking for something that's 95% or 97%. It's got to be 100%, or as close enough to 100%. And as I say, that does wipe out a lot of the the crap that's out there. But I think if fact checking is going to have a sustainable future, I really think it's got to be that way. We're not, we can't do much about predictions. We're not interested in opinions. People can have their awful opinions. We are all for the 100% kind of provable facts. So yeah, when we're thinking about things, it's those two things. Is it consequential, and is it provably false? And if it ticks those two boxes, then we'll usually forge ahead.
Yeah, I mean,
Jim,
life's a little bit more challenging for us in that, we've taken on this sort of mandate to look at areas such as, does an outlet mix news and opinion by, in most cases, not clearly differentiating via their labeling? We got a lot of notice in the last month or so. One of the sort of big institutions which I've sort of taken as my jurisdiction is the New York Times, which we originally rated maybe 5 years ago and have updated 1 million times. And for 2 or 3 years, we've had serious internal discussions about whether the most famous news organization has sort of gone over a cliff when it comes to mixing news and opinion. And in some ways, it started a little bit with their animus toward Trump. And, they're one of the first few folks who used the word lie, just matter-of-factly in news stories. But we continued giving them a thumbs up on that one criterion until recently. And we just had long discussions. I looked at, hundreds and hundreds of stories, and I said, there are too many news stories with unlabeled opinion. And so we downgraded them, which was a significant move by us, and again, got some attention. And I think pretty notable was their lack of response. I mean, there really wasn't anything they could say about all the examples we sent them. And we sent them, okay, here's stories that trouble us. But I should also say that decision of what to choose on a given day or given week, I mean, amid this flood of misinformation, we rely a lot on our analysts who are monitoring maybe, hundreds of sites and hundreds of social media areas, YouTube channels and other social media accounts, to just find things and bring it up for discussion. And there may be trouble. A woman who speaks Chinese was the one who was looking at Chinese media last year and saw that they had some crazy theories on the source of the wildfires, if you remember, in Hawaii. I mean, wildfires, a subject you guys know a lot more about than we do. And so as a result of her tip, we started looking at that stuff and finding out that it was just totally bogus and erroneous information that they were spreading. But again, we have a staff meeting every morning. These issues come up. Should we spend our time looking at such and such? And then we decide whether to proceed. But there's just, as Nick knows, I mean, there's everybody knows here in this discussion. It's just, we're sort of overwhelmed by the amount of misinformation out there.
Jim, some researchers argue that correcting mis and disinformation can back.
I think we may have lost from there, Jim. Can you hear her, or?
Well, I think there was a question about whether this work, whether correcting misinformation, disinformation, and doing what we call debunking can backfire. Sure, I guess, and in a highly polarized political atmosphere as we have in the U.S. and throughout the world now, where there is less and less acceptance of any shared facts on any situation, and by doing fact checking or assessing the credibility of the site, you immediately open yourselves up to claims that you're being somehow political. Our approach is to try to gain trust by only focusing on provably false claims, not gray assertions by politicians, for example, and focusing on truly authoritative sources and figuring out the provenance, the origin of a claim, and how it's spread, which can be absolutely fascinating. there was a famous American politician who was, for a bunch of years, she was the first female Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi. There was a break-in her house a year or two ago in San Francisco, and immediately crazy claims of who broke in, particularly by weird right-wing news sources, and saying, oh, in fact, this was the husband's gay lover. And we tracked all this down to one particular site called the Santa Monica Observer. And we ended up just showing that this was absolutely totally false, but also showing how it had spread, how a lot of folks with very big social media audiences had just regurgitated this claim. And I should also say, and I think this is an important point we haven't mentioned, which is why we have a good deal of business from ad agencies. That was the sort of story we were looking at. We were looking at this website that we'd never heard of called Santa Monica Observer. And there in the top right was an advertisement for a famous American reputable insurance company. Well, as we found out, neither the insurance company nor the ad agency had any clue that that ad was on that site. It has resulted in our getting a fair amount of business from major ad agencies who have for years been touting to their clients the targeted sophistication of so-called programmatic advertising, basically using algorithms, blah, blah, blah. So you want to target left-handed 40-year-old women in Melbourne for your product, or whatever it might be. And so the ad agency says, oh, no problem. We know all the media outlets that appeal to left-handed women in Melbourne. And don't just leave it to us. So the client has been leaving it to them. Well, now it turns out that the same programmatic advertising is landing that ad on pro-Putin, anti-Ukraine sites, racist sites, anti-gay sites, and neither party in the transaction knew about that. And so that's why we now have, out of the blue, a lot of American ad agencies who are essentially admitting that this technology which they've sold to their clients worldwide is pretty close to bogus.
Yeah.
Ben, do you actually pay any attention to the likely source of the erroneous facts?
It is something we are hoping to do more of. It is quite difficult, particularly when these claims are kind of crossing platforms and crossing borders, national borders. It's very difficult. We're currently looking at some technology which will hopefully enable us to do that a bit more. Because there's certainly, we see stuff all the time and we just have no idea where it comes from. Particularly with The Voice last year, there was a lot of kind of predictable mis and disinformation, but there was some stuff that we did not expect and we had no idea where it came from. We still don't really have any idea where it came from. It certainly had all the hallmarks of being from overseas and, information that really was just kind of put out there to kind of stir the pot and to, disrupt community kind of cohesion. So it's very difficult is the short answer. And as I say, it's something we're working with a few different tech providers at the moment to hopefully get to the bottom of. Because look, it's really important. I think if you can point to the source and kill it at the source, then you're saving yourself a lot of trouble.
And I might add that we've also sort of similarly stumbled in to a lot of work checking out the origins of images, of photographs. Demonstrations, anti-Israeli demonstrations on U.S. campuses, and a site has this, picture of thousands of people. Well, yes, it may be a legitimate photo, but it wasn't of that event. It was of something 2 years ago elsewhere. And there is technology now that makes it a lot easier to track down the provenance. Much trickier is something that's gaining increasing currency, which we're all reading about more and more, which is the use of AI to generate false images, which really offers us, all of us, in the journalism world a huge challenge. I mean, we have, if you can believe it, we've done assessments of now hundreds of totally bogus sites created by AI. As best we can tell, no human editor involved, but just the creation of sites which increasingly are fairly sophisticated looking. And there have been a bunch of cases where I've had to go to a 20-something with whom I work, who knows a lot more about this than I do, and say, so this sports site in the UK, how do I know this is by AI? And then she'll look at it for 2 minutes and find, oh, well, there's this garbled sentence right in the middle here, and this thing is repeated 3 times, and this sentence makes no sense, blah, 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 blah. But increasingly, I have a hard time telling.
Thank you. I'm wondering about how the fact-checking space has changed in the last decade. So we've seen a steep rise in organisations start up fact-checking units and independent organisations doing fact checks as well. But there has been a little bit of a drop-off. And so I'm just wondering, how do you feel that the sector has matured over the past decade? Are we in decline? I mean, we saw the closure of the RMIT ABC fact-checking unit. Somebody has asked a question about that. So I'm just wondering where you see the space going, and is it at risk of sharp decline?
Yeah, I mean, there was some research out recently, I think as you referenced, that did show a bit of a decline. And my answer here is not in reference to any Australian fact-checking outfit as such, but because it was very much looking at kind of global figures, and I don't read too much into it, to be honest, and perhaps even see it as a good thing. I certainly got the impression that a lot of fact-checking outfits were simply trying to take advantage of the money that was being put forward by social media companies over the last few years, and they were trying to cash in where they could. And again, this is not about any outfit in Australia, because I don't think that was happening here, but certainly kind of overseas, they were treating fact-checking as a bit of a fundraising exercise. That's not to say that it didn't do any good work, but I think that'll always kind of land you in trouble. So I certainly get the feel that the fact-checking units that remain are the kind of serious players who are playing the long game and want to see this as a viable kind of industry in the future. But in terms of I can talk about how it's changed for us. I mean, I would say that we certainly don't see fact-checking, debunking claims as the solution anymore. We don't see that as a silver bullet. It's very much kind of part of the solution. We talk now about having a kind of 3-pronged attack. Fact-checking is still kind of a huge part of what we do. That is kind of reacting to bad information that's already out there and acting on it as quickly as possible and getting the correct information out there. But we're also starting to do what we call pre-bunking. Now, this is trying to get ahead of the problem. This is, predicting misinformation trends that likely appear, predicting disinformation that will, surround a certain upcoming event. And this kind of pre-bunking works hand in hand with what's called inoculation theory. That is, you inoculate an audience about future bad information by telling them about it and telling them what to expect and why it's wrong. And it's been shown to have considerable success. So we see that as a kind of key part of what we do as a fact-checking unit going forward. And the third part, which I've already spoken about, is media literacy. And that's, we can't debunk everything. We can't predict everything with a pre-bunk. So it's about making sure that Australians have those kind of core skills to be able to deal with bad information when they're, met with it. So yeah, that's certainly how we see our future as a fact-checking unit. This kind of 3-pronged attack. But look, I have no doubt that will evolve. I have no doubt that fact-checking is going to be very different in a couple of years' time, and that's good and that's exciting, and we are nimble and flexible, and we'll move with the times.
Yeah, I'll just say, Fran, Nick, and Ben, just quickly, I sort of look at this from a slightly different vantage point, having sort of been a child of American newspaper and newsrooms and seen their rise and lived through a period of time where there they're almost making tons of money to spite themselves. And now, having seen over the last 20 years the implosion in the business model, particularly on the local scene, and it's the same in every city in the US, and whether it's the local, once vibrant local newspaper, TV station, or radio station, they've all seen, most of their advertising disappear, going to the likes of Facebook, Google, Amazon. And the result of that has been the hollowing out of newsrooms and, just your basic desks with editors who used to read stories and sort of do their own separate fact checking, which are increasingly just vanishing all around the country. I mean, there are newspapers in this country which we have found which literally have not a single journalist in the newsroom anymore. The big parent company is creating the illusion of a local newspaper in cities as big as one city in California, 190,000 people. And they're using stories by surrounding newspapers and putting them in that newspaper. In fact, there's not a single journalist left in that town, that newspaper, to cover local city hall or the zoning board or whatever. So, that to me is a trouble. When I was managing of the Chicago Tribune, so 2008, we had about 670 in the newsroom. Now it's down to about 100. So whether it was fact-checking recipes or a murder story or a political story from Washington, D.C., those people aren't around. And I think at this moment, at least, as encouraging it is to see the rise of fact-checking organizations, I think those numbers pale by comparison to what we've lost in the local newspaper, TV, radio station newsroom.
Ben, I want to go to the Voice referendum and how fact-checking was portrayed by the right-wing media. So it was accused of being biased and of censoring debate, and we saw some of the elements in Australia that, Jim, you'd be really familiar with in the US, a real politicization of fact-checking that I think up until then we were, kind of immune from to a degree. I'm just wondering, how did you respond to those claims, and have you thought more about them since?
Yeah, it's, stuff like that is always front of mind. As I say, we're always thinking about the long-term viability of fact-checking. And there was a bit of a backlash with the Voice, debate. I remember when the campaign first kicked off, I remember us speaking as a kind of leadership group about making sure we had as even a possible split of claims from the yes and no camp. That was something that was kind of really important to us. We wanted to cover this, very important issue as fairly as possible. But then a few weeks in, we had our staff spending, a disproportionate amount of time looking for claims from the yes side, and they just weren't there. Certainly not claims that were provably false, as I kind of spoke about earlier, and certainly not in the same number. And we got to the stage where we were having to let claims go from the no side, having to let them go unchecked because we were desperately trying to kind of balance the ledger. So we sat down again and kind of spoke about this, and we decided that was not balanced. We were not doing our job properly. So we decided to look at it a bit differently, and this is kind of how we look at things now. Balance for us is not 50-50. There's no point trying to get 50-50 if that is not what's out there. Instead, we just want to accurately reflect what we are seeing out there in the mis and disinformation environment. So if that is 80%, 90% from one side, then it'll be 80% or 90% of checks. And, that was the reality with the Voice. I think there are a number of reasons for that. And, that's perhaps another discussion. But, I guess the yes side had to make everyone feel kind of warm and fuzzy about this concept. And that didn't really lend itself to claims, let alone false claims. Whereas I guess no had to persuade people that this was, a terrible idea and it would negatively impact them. And that line of attack did lend itself to claims. There's various other things such as, we certainly saw the sovereign citizen community become involved in this, and they're very much on the no side. Certainly the kind of anti-vax community as well that we saw kind of grow out of COVID. One of their big things obviously is government overreach and control, and they saw the Voice as an extension of that. So we soon started seeing a lot of claims there as well. But yeah, We struggled with it for a long time, but as I say, we justify it, and we think we tackled it the right way by treating balance as a fair reflection of what we were seeing. And we produced a fair reflection of what we were seeing. And we very much stand by that. And we think that's a good model to kind of go forward when we're looking at other kind of major events and elections and what have you.
And Jim, can you give us a sense from the US what we might expect in the future in Australia in terms of the politicisation of fact checking?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing it all over the world. It's not just in the US. I mean, where we work, we have to do a lot of work in Europe. As I said earlier on, you're seeing the same thing where people are claiming that basically there's no such thing as a fact. And, oh, that's what you claim. And Donald Trump, well, that's what you say he did. Whereas once upon a time you could show a video or a transcript and say, no, this is what Fran said, or Nick said. Now that can just often fall on deaf ears. So the answer to your question, I'm just sort of mumbling circuitously around here. I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I think you can fully expect greater politicization. And one of the elements I mentioned at the top that sort of got us into all this, which was our sensitivity to the decline of trust in media. It's very facile for American politicians to just sort of bash us, and that will gain lots of applause. But hopefully we can, like all American media, can start doing a better job in promoting the value of fair and impartial media, and the value particularly on the local level, and helping people engage with their community and being more politically engaged. The last election we had here a few months ago in Chicago, which has a reputation of being, such a political town, turnout was 20%. 20%. Now, somewhere in the mix, I don't know exactly where, somewhere in the mix is the dramatic decline in the amount of information that's out there for people to read about what's going on in their communities. I don't know whether it's 5% of it or 10% or 6%, but somewhere in this increasing lack of interest and engagement of what's going on in their hometown. And I'm speaking to you from a house in a beautiful block in an upscale neighborhood in Chicago, $1 million homes. And there are not many folks who in the morning when I walk my dog are getting a newspaper delivered anymore. And there are just as many folks with Harvard law degrees who live in the neighborhood who are as misinformed as my teenagers, who are just look at TikTok and have a hard time differentiating or don't know how to differentiate between some stupid conspiratorial-filled TikTok video and the front page of the New York Times. Yeah. They don't know. It's all the same. So I have not in any way, shape, or form answered your question about what lessons there are to learn. But you just hope that particularly in the local levels here, come up with new, more vibrant business models to resuscitate failing newspapers, radio stations, TV, newsrooms, and just tell folks more about what's going on, particularly by their government.
Thanks, Jim. I want to go to questions from our viewers shortly, but before we do that, I'm just wondering if you can tell me maybe 3 or 4 tips for journalists who are tuning in, and also, comms people as well who are also listening today, tips for fact-checking their own work and basically doing a better job of, stopping misinformation before it's published. Jim, do you want to go first on that?
Well, nothing much beyond stepping back and figuring out what the best source might be to find out whether, if Ron or Nick tells me they have these 3 great degrees from famous universities in Australia. Well, go check. How do you know that to be the case? And then also to make sure you're in the reflexive habit of calling for comment about stuff. It's just sort of basic journalism 101, but it's disheartening to me about the extent to which, particularly when it comes to sort of public officials, that there's just not much skepticism by the folks who are often covering them about what they say. And again, part of the reason is there's so far fewer. The state legislature of Illinois, in Springfield, Illinois, traditionally one of the most corrupt. There were once about 10 years ago, 32 people full-time for various media around the state of Illinois covering the legislature. Last time I checked 5 or 6 years ago, there were 4. 4. It's just you can't do it. I mean, and that's where the real kinky things go on, the stuff that gets put in bills, which only refer to one constituent's business, but are, very elaborately written and try to, to deceive one. But if you don't have folks, guarding the hen house, you're going to be in trouble. But I would say, just check everything somebody tells you and be prepared to answer a question from the editor. How do you know that to be true? How do you know that to be true? Again, I'll defer to Ben on a more articulate way of framing the challenge to young journalists.
Yeah, no, I think as Jim says at the start, the kind of most important thing that we tell people when we're doing media literacy courses is to pause. Don't click share, don't retweet, don't post what someone's told you. And there are loads of fantastic tools and verification tech that you can use, but for us, when we're trying to do our media literacy, whether it's to journalists or to everyday folk, we can't get past the kind of 3-question checklist which we run through our head every time we come across a piece of information, and that is who has said it, why have they said it, have they got an agenda, what's their reputation. Second question, what's the evidence? Have they pointed to any evidence? Is there any evidence out there? And thirdly, what do trusted sources say? And I think if you live by that checklist of those 3 questions, you will save yourself a lot of bother. I mean, you take the poor Channel 7 employee who named the Bondi stabbers Benjamin Cohen. If he or she had run through those 3 questions, that would not have been published. There's a lot of fancy tech, but those 3 questions will get you out of trouble 99 times out of 100.
Thanks,
So
Ben.
I'm just looking at one of our assessments of an Australian site, xyz.net. And our conclusion is at the very top, a website that publishes white nationalist and anti-Semitic content that has repeatedly published false information about the Holocaust, 9/11, COVID-19. And we give examples of what we mean about false information about the Holocaust and COVID. There are some things that are facts. And so we go through each one of the examples we found and, include all our reaching out to them and what they had to say or didn't say. But if anybody wants a test case example of how not to do it, go to xyz.net right there in your own backyard.
Okay, let's turn now to questions from other participants. So there's a question from Bill Bernbauer. Ben, I don't understand the relationship with Facebook and Meta sites. Is there any conflict of interest there?
No, I mean we've been a partner with Meta for several years now. I think since 2019, certainly since I've been with AP Fact Check. And they're incredibly hands-off. They give us a framework of what they want us to look at and not look at, and this is all online. You can search it and find it, but it's very similar to kind of what I spoke about earlier, it being kind of consequential and verifiably false. So we, get paid by them to do independent fact checking, but other than that, we don't really have any communication from them. I've never been contacted by anyone at Meta saying, don't check that or check this. I've never been contacted saying you need to change that or you need to change this. I'm sure if they were unhappy with what we did, we'd get booted from the program. But yeah, as I say, it's you can search it. If you search kind of Meta fact checking program, something like that, you'll see the kind of guidelines that they provide us, and that's it. They give us that. They let us produce the fact checks. When we produce the fact checks, we attach them to a piece of content, and that will radically reduce its spread. Yeah, again, I won't bore you with all the details. You can Google it and find it. But yeah, it's good. It's a good relationship, and it's not perfect, the system. But I mean, you look at something like X. At least Meta is doing something. Is the way I see it.
Next, we have a question from Marie. Do you find right-wing media outlets launching their own fact-checking units or aligning with any particular ones, or are they impervious to the need for fact-checking? I haven't come across any right-wing fact-checking outlets. Have you, Jim?
I don't think. I mean, there are outlets, for instance, who will attack us, right-wing outlets who attack us and under the guise of doing their own separate fact-checking, but I don't think they tend to have separate units. I mean, they may have an editor who is checking a 22-year-old reporter's work, but I don't think it goes much beyond that. And I might say that we get the right wing in this country will accuse us of partisanship because we have given flunking grades to more conservative media outlets than the liberal outlets. But lost in that charge is the fact that there are a lot more conservative sources of information than there are liberal ones. And so the percentages are sort of, roughly the same. But they'll say, oh, you've given flunking marks to 635 conservative sites, but only 325 liberal ones, blah, 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 blah. And then we'll say, well, wait a second, there are X times more things on the right than there are on the left, and that falls on deaf ears and conversation ends.
Thanks, Jim. The next question is from Sue Elson. How can we encourage more information providers to include facts rather than opinion? Do facts need to be more accessible? And Jim, I know that you're doing some work in that space, rating news outlets based on whether or not they differentiate opinion from analysis or opinion from news. Sorry.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, you've had in this country and everywhere else for a long time, and the internet sort of really accelerated this, the reality that, and we'll all have to admit it in our own lives, content that's more provocative, responsible or not, can attract our attention to a far greater extent than something that's sort of down the middle and serious and even profound, like The Conversation. That conversation may not be really great reading as you're in the back seat on a 200-mile drive or something like that, when you can take out your cell phone and look at TMZ and find out the latest alleged atrocity of sexual violence by some rapper somewhere in Miami or somewhere else. And I think that's one of the challenges. And I think establishment, mainstream media suffers from a lot of self-inflicted wounds. And I was in newsrooms in the late 80s and 90s when we started convincing ourselves that we had to sort of be more analytical for folks on our page one and tell them what something really meant. And that ended up being a somewhat slippery slope, where increasingly the news stories were both more analytical and more opinionated, and our labeling got a little loosey-goosey. And now to the point where I think a fair number of Americans rightfully can say they're confused They're confused. What's the difference in news story and opinion, especially when you're not clearly labeling it as such? So I would hope at a minimum, and we've had some impact, as I said, about 20% of the folks that we have criticized have changed some of their practices. And one of them has been a lot of folks being much more overt in how they label a piece, what's commentary or news. So I think that's one thing that can help. But I think the train's out of the station as far as media, particularly in an age in which revenues are declining and have become sort of very much beholden to the number of clicks they get online, goosing up stories or playing stories that aren't terribly significant, but may just have a greater potential populist appeal.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know how you're going to change that. I mean, I don't know how many, for instance, television newscasts over there that you really sit down now and learn something from. I mean, here in the most prominent American newscasters, it's just formulaic. It's a big crime story, a big Trump story, a big weather story, and if there's a wind gust more than 5 miles an hour, you make sure to send out your reporter with a, oversized nylon windbreaker flopping in the wind and claim with big, bold chyron that, weather disaster hitting, northern Illinois, blah, 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 blah. People somehow may be galvanized to that rather than what they might consider some more turgid, policy-driven stories that may actually ultimately have more impact on their lives. But once again, I'm punting here. I'm not sure what the answer.
We are just about out of time. Ben, I just want to ask you a really quick question from Tracy Ellis about whether you get lots of communications professionals proactively seeking to correct misinformation by working with your team. And a short answer is okay, because we've got about 1 minute to go.
Yeah, not in real time. We've certainly tried to do quite a bit of training, and that's something we're hoping to kind of ramp up. And look, we're well open to doing any training to anyone who wants it. But no, not in real time, no.
Right. Well, that brings us to the end of the webinar. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Remember that this is the first of 3 webinars on mis and disinformation, so do join in for the next one next week and then the week after. Thanks so much to Ben James and to Jim Warren. Jim, I hope you are going off to bed soon or having a nightcap or something. Thanks for joining us.
No, I'm not. I've got to catch up on some sports results. But just to let everybody listening know, in Australia, you are not alone on this subject. You are not alone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.